Welcome back to Intro to Physical Anthropology. I'm your professor, David Leitner, and today we're talking about the cell. We're going to specifically focus on a little bit of history of the cell, parts of cell anatomy that are going to be relevant for our discussions of DNA function and structure next time, and just a quick sort of summary of cell biology that you've probably covered before, but if it's been a while or you haven't, here it is for you. Okay. So, the cell is literally the basic building block of life. There are things that are quasi-life, like viruses that don't exist as cells necessarily, but all living things are composed of cells, one cell or more cells. To qualify as a living thing, something has to show the properties of life, and these are, it has to exhibit order, response to stimuli, reproduction, can make more of itself, right? Development, so it grows or changes, regulation, so that it sort of maintains some kind of chemical consistency. Homeostasis, which keeps things from getting out of whack. And finally, energy processing. We think of that as eating, okay? Plants think of it as photosynthesizing. Well, plants don't think of it, but still. So the take-home is all life exists as cells, whether it's single-celled life forms or multicellular life forms. Now, the origins of cellular life go back at least 3.4 billion years ago. That's a long time because the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. So it took about 1 billion years for the Earth itself to cool off enough that you could have liquid water that wouldn't boil away. And that is when we start seeing the first signs of life. The interesting thing is how we know these things existed isn't through direct fossils of the cells, but of the things they left behind. There is a kind of bacteria that forms something called a stromatolite. So they grow as a thin film, and they deposit minerals as they grow. And when they reproduce, they form a new layer of cells as the old layer dies. So there's this sort of constant buildup, and they grow in these mats that ultimately sort of become little tiny pillars. Well, some of those fossilize, and the oldest fossils we've got 3.4 billion years. Probably they were a lot like blue-green algae, which is not truly algae. It's not a plant, it's a bacteria, but they were very simple. They were basically a lipid sort of membrane surrounding the DNA material. Okay, some of them had added little things like a flagella, which is something that helps it move, or little pili, which help it sense its environment and that sort of thing. But basically, inside of the cell, you've got all the mechanisms of the cell, all the things the cell needs to maintain life, all together in one sack. So the DNA and everything else is all together. Well, that's not the most ideal arrangement for cellular life, because DNA is very, very brittle. So starting around 1.5 billion years ago, and then again 850 million years ago, we start to see eukaryotes. Now, eukaryotes are like a bag within a bag. In eukaryotes, there's an inner sac here that you can see that contains all of the DNA, as well as amino acids and RNA that are going to be involved in protein synthesis and signaling. And that sits within a larger sac that contains all the rest of the organelles, all the rest of the things the cell needs to be alive. This includes us. It includes all the multicellulars. It includes many, many, many single cellular life forms. So this is sort of like the basic, this is the Plan for Life 2.0 right here, okay? And the advantage there is the DNA is protected from chemical interactions with other things in the cell so that it doesn't break down as easily. Now, as this multicellular organism, your cells specialize, okay? And we are going to be concerned with two main types of cells today. There are somatic cells, which are the cells that make up the bulk of your body. And somatic cells contain two sets of DNA, one from your mother, one from your father, okay? Somatic cells use a process called meiosis that we'll talk about a little bit in a future video. And they are not involved in reproduction of the organism at all. Changes to your somatic cells will not affect the children you have later. On the other hand, reproductive cells, or sex cells, also called gametes, that is sperm and eggs. Changes to those will affect your offspring, okay? So, these are all the reproductive cells in your body, and they only contain one set of DNA. And they get that one set through the process of meiosis, and it's going to be a mix of your mother and father's DNA, okay? So, two main kinds of cells. Really remember gametes here and meiosis, because that's going to be really important for several chapters in this book. The interior of the cell is composed of a number of different structures that are important. The first is that central sac containing the DNA. That's called the nucleus. It keeps the genetic material safe, like I said before, and it contains DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. And DNA is important because it controls protein production, and everything that gets done in the cell requires proteins, okay? And as we'll find out in a little bit, protein production doesn't happen actually in the nucleus where the DNA is, but rather a message gets sent out of the nucleus and it occurs out in the cytoplasm, as we'll find out, at the endoplasmic reticulum. Ribonucleic acid is a related molecule. Deoxyribonucleic acid has two strands that look like a ladder somebody has twisted down the middle, okay? Ribonucleic acid is just like one half of that. It's not chemically identical, but it's very, very similar. The nuclear envelope is the sac itself, and it is like a strainer. It only allows molecules of a certain size to come in and out, and that means only RNA and amino acids can get in and out of there. And there you have it in the center. So this is you could tell I failed coloring in kindergarten, but luckily that's not a prerequisite for college. So, so you've got the nucleus in blue containing the DNA, and the nuclear envelope in yellow there. Next you have mitochondria. Mitochondria are sometimes called the powerhouses of the cell. That's because they produce a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, which is it helps drive a lot of chemical reactions in the cell. So it makes those things possible. Mitochondria, interestingly enough, have their own set of DNA. We refer to this as mtDNA. And mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from your mother. So your mother, your mother's mother, your mother's mother's mother all have the exact same mitochondrial DNA, barring any mutations that may have sort of come up. Interestingly enough, it is a very old structure in the eukaryotic cell, and we think it's probably the result of an ancient symbiotic relationship between two organisms. The organism that the mitochondria used to be, would have been specialized in producing materials that the larger organism could then consume, and in exchange, the mitochondria were protected from the larger environment. Okay? Interestingly, it's not the only time this has happened. We think this is how chloroplasts show up in plant cells. It's kind of interesting that that kind of symbiotic relationship happened more than once in evolutionary history. And so we have these molecular fossils in our cells, cellular fossils. Right, those are the purple things here. Please don't laugh. I know, I try my hardest, but it's getting better. Endoplasmic reticulum. You heard me mention this before. This is a long folded sheet of material that runs throughout the cytoplasm, which is the sort of all the stuff. It's the liquid filling the cell. It has a smooth form and a rough form. The rough form is covered in these tiny little molecular dots called ribosomes. And these ribosomes are they're integral to the process of protein synthesis. So making proteins. They're like little factories. And that is why they're involved in this process of protein synthesis. I'll lecture about in one of the next lectures. This folded structure is important because it gives it greater surface area. Since the ribosomes are only on the surface of the endoplasmic reticulum, having more surface area is a generally good idea. If you want to fit a sheet in your backpack, it's actually better to just stuff it in, right? You can fit a lot of surface area in a relatively small space. Okay, that's the green, the stuff I colored green here. And the tiny dots would be the ribosomes, represent them. They're actually much smaller than that. So those ribosomes, by the way, they are made up of their own RNA, not DNA, RNA. And we call it ribosomal RNA, or rRNA. See, it all makes sense. These scientific terms are all based in some kind of logic, right? And it is involved, it is itself made up of proteins, but it is involved in producing proteins as well. Nice little chicken and egg thing there, right? Protein synthesis begins out at the nucleus and is completed in the cytoplasm, okay? And when I say that, what I mean is that the cytoplasm is where the process is, the ribosome is where the process is completed. There you go. Now I've colored them red so you can see them more clearly. The cytoplasm itself is the next thing. That is the fluid surrounding, basically filling up the entire cell. It contains all of these other structures floating around in it. And it itself also contains all these free-floating amino acids, bits of RNA, bits of ATP, a whole bunch of other molecules that the cell is using. Like, it's transporting these things through the cytoplasm to different organelles so that it can do the things that it needs to do. There you go. And finally, we've got the plasma or cell membrane. This is the outer sac, okay? And it's not just a sac. It contains everything. It helps keep everything together, and it protects it from the outside, making sure that only the stuff that should get inside the cell gets in. So in other words, it regulates the transport of material that comes out of the cell and material that goes into the cell. It also then, therefore, governs the communication and coordination between cells, because in order to communicate, they have to release molecules that the other cells recognize. This is why, and by the way, this is how viruses work. They break into the cell by having a little bit of RNA that's shaped like one of the keys, molecular keyholes on the plasma membrane, and they trick the plasma membrane into allowing it to go into the cell. That's how that works. So it's relevant, right? Okay, so that's it for the cell right now. Think of this as your orientation. You're sort of, we're just giving you the landscape here. So make sure you're sort of familiar with these terms and familiar with sort of where these structures are in the cell, so that as we start talking about the structure and function of DNA in the next video, it will make sense to you, okay? Because there's going to be a lot of terms coming out, and so if you know them ahead of time, it's going to be easier to understand the next video. Good luck with that, and take care of yourself. Have a great day.